If civil discourse is to break out in this country, why not on Saturday night? Live. I'm Scott Ott with Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, and this episode of Right Angle is brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com. Men, you could have knocked me over with a feather when I saw this week's episode of Saturday Night Live. Not the whole thing. I wouldn't dare watch the entire thing. But I did see an excerpt of Weekend Update. And in that excerpt, Pete Davidson, who's an actor on Saturday Night Live, alleged comedian, came out and apologized for some insulting remarks that he had made the previous week about a then Texas Congress candidate named Lieutenant Commander Dan Crenshaw. And it was a little bit that they do where Pete Davidson puts up pictures of people and then says, this guy looks like something, and makes a cutting remark about it. Anyway, this past week, Pete Davidson apologized, and then, in a stroke of brilliance, Lorne Michaels, the executive producer of Saturday Night Live, had Lieutenant Commander Dan Crenshaw, now Congressman-elect, roll onto the scene and engage with the comic. He made a few funny remarks about him and kind of played the same game that Pete Davidson was playing. He accepted Pete's apology, and then he went on to make some remarks about the kind of country we are, the importance of forgiveness, and I will add this, Lieutenant Commander Dan Crenshaw lost an eye during his third tour in Afghanistan and wears an eye patch at all times, and he's a Republican. And he said that this is Veterans Day weekend, and he said, when you see a veteran, make sure you thank him, but even better, I want to ask you to say something else. I want to ask you to say, never forget. Because that lets them know that we have not forgotten the sacrifice that they made, and we're all in it together. The sacrifice that my colleagues in arms in the Navy SEALs and elsewhere have made, and he said the sacrifice that Pete Davidson's dad made on September 11th, 2001. It was one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen on TV, and Stephen Green, I'm still recuperating from the idea that this happened on Saturday Night Live.
Right.
And wondering if there could be a second striking of the lightning, so to speak. Is this something that people will look at and say, hey, maybe we all ought to treat each other a little more like this?
And we should. And the thing is, we all mess up. My beef with Davidson isn't that what wasn't the insult. It's that that whole shtick just isn't funny. It's a little cutting thing based on the most superficial element, which is somebody's appearance, and it's not funny. It doesn't hit you in the belly. It doesn't hit you in the intellect. It doesn't make you laugh or appreciate his wit or any of that. It kind of reminds me of David Spade used to have his Hollywood Minute, and after you saw that spiel a couple of times on Saturday Night Live, you were pretty much done with it. You need something more than Triumph the comic insult dog to be funny over the long term. But there is something important here, and that is this ability to apologize and forgive. I won't bore you with the details, but I had a bad dad moment a couple of weeks ago where, in trying to correct my older son, who just stepped over a line, not meaning to, he was trying to be funny and it just didn't work. I then went way over the line in correcting him, and I didn't notice the effect my words had on my son. And my wife nudged me and said, "You really hurt his feelings." Whew. And we've all been there at some point. And I immediately sat my son down, and not only did I apologize to him, but it was the most heartfelt, abject, I am at your mercy apology. I told him not only did I go over the line, but what I said was factually wrong. I just screwed up. And I won't do that again, or at least I'm going to try not to do that again.
Sweet.
And we both choked back some tears, and there hasn't been a word said about it since then. And the reason is, I hope that I was able to do the right thing and apologize in such a way that my son knows that he's not the one who screwed up. Dad did that. And I think our kids need to be able to see us as human beings, just like we need to be able to see our politicians as human beings and our comedians as human beings, and nobody really holds that high of a moral ground, I don't think. We all screw up. We all need to be able to apologize when we do, and just as importantly, the other person needs to accept that apology, and bless them both, those gentlemen on Saturday Night Live, because they both did the exact right thing in the exact right way, and that gave me a laugh.
Bill, Congressman-elect Crenshaw came out onto the set of Weekend Update and initially thanked Pete Davidson for making a Republican look good. And, that got a big laugh in
that
the
is
audience.
Funny.
That was terrific. At the end of the episode, when they were, they pulled out to the wide shot and the microphones are supposedly cut, Pete Davidson leaned over and shook hands with Lieutenant Commander Dan Crenshaw and said some words to the effect of, "You're a really great guy." This morning, I read in a publication that I don't even want to mention because I'm afraid somebody will go click and read and they'll get their second, reader of the day. But somebody was immediately saying the only one who should celebrate as a result of what happened on Saturday Night Live this weekend is Dan Crenshaw's publicist, because he scored a coup there. And Crenshaw, wasn't he the guy who was one of the administrators of a Facebook group that was a far-right group calling itself Tea Party that was somehow related to the Charlotte rally for white rights or whatever it was? And it was so obscure that even I, after reading the brief story, could not get what they were trying to say he was. But I just thought, is it utterly impossible, Bill, for this country to ever have a moment where we come together, acknowledge something we did was wrong, be big enough to accept the apology, and then move on common ground toward shared objectives?
A lot to say here. The main advantage of the internet is it allows regular people to have a voice. And the main disadvantage of the internet is it allows regular people to have a voice. What that means is people who would never make comments in public make comments and say things in private on the internet through the mask of anonymity that is driving what should be civil discourse into Sybil discourse, just a bunch of schizophrenics yelling and screaming at each other and raving and foaming at the mouth. And we're all as guilty of this as anybody else. I have to tell you, when you were telling me about the veteran talking about what a great country it was, I immediately flashed to the NBC control room and guys jumping over chairs trying to find where that 7-second kill switch is, This is really the first thought I had. We can't have somebody talking about how good America is, not on this network. The only consolation, and it's a strong consolation, is that this enormous fracture in the country, enormous fracture, it's getting bigger all the time, absolutely vanishes at a football game, let's say, or any other thing where it's no longer Republicans versus Democrats, it's Bears and the Packers, and you find that these superficial differences that seem so important in the political argument are just really emotionally ginned up and magnified by the internet. And listen, you guys know by now I am the least conspiracy theory minded guy in the world, but if I was Vladimir Putin, let's say, I wouldn't be messing around with trying to win elections. What I would be doing is I would be setting an emotional tone of where the opponents are painted so darkly that people's entire fight or flight reaction is activated by something that some, dip politician has to say. So I'm a lot more sympathetic to it than I was earlier. Excuse me, when you first told me about the story in our backstage show, I thought something happened. Did he get enough letters? Did somebody call him? And it's just the idea that he would wake up the next morning and feel remorse for something like that just didn't seem possible. But maybe that is what happened. But in any event, this rabidness that attaches itself to our political discussions in this country seem to completely evaporate when we talk about anything else. Anything else. And we all know that feeling, that kind of that grace note feeling we have where we see somebody who we know is like on the other side of the political spectrum to us, and you say hi, or or you wave or whatever, hey, how's it going? And it's like, yeah, okay, so it's not the end of the world. But I really do think this is a product primarily of the internet and the dehumanizing, amplifying quality of it. It makes human expression go much, much further, much, much louder, and it's much tinnier. There's no timbre in that voice. There's no warmth in it. It's a very thin, treble-only screech that can be heard from a long, long way away, and that is a major problem, and I don't know what to do about that.
I encourage all of our viewers to watch this episode of Weekend Update. You can see it on YouTube, because I think I saw in those maybe 4 minutes more of America as she should be, as she often is, and as she rarely gets credit for, than I've seen in any 4 minutes of TV anywhere. Dan Crenshaw comes out and he gives a little ribbing, and then he reaches for Pete Davidson's hand, and he conjures the mystic bonds of consanguinity. He brings people together, and it is how it used to be at a picnic, in our little subdivision, where the kids would gather and put playing cards in their bicycle spokes, and there would be somebody setting off firecrackers, and I remember somebody threw the dry ice into the creek, and it was, steam was coming up off of it, and there you could smell the sausage patties and hot dogs, and neighbors who didn't really know each other intimately, but knew each other well enough to exchange gentle jokes and to ask about their folks and to see how they were doing. And that's the sense I got from watching this episode of Saturday Night Live. It was a Navy SEAL missing an eye, looking at a guy who is everything that a Navy SEAL is not. And that I don't say in much of a positive way, but he's a skinny little comedian who's fraught with anxiety. And Lieutenant Commander Dan Crenshaw reaches over to him, shakes his hand, and says, "You and I are both Americans. We know people who sacrifice. Your dad sacrificed, and we should never forget that." That's got to happen more if this country is going to really pull together. And the big man in this picture is not necessarily the guy who's the Navy SEAL. It's the guy who's willing to set aside his hurt. It's the guy who's willing to say, I'm not going to take offense at this because I see in the other guy who's insulting me some of my own flaws, and I'm going to overlook them because we can all be better men. And I'm going to find something that pulls us together, and we are going to move ahead. This is the kind of guy I want to elect to office. This is the kind of guy that I want to have running my organization. This is the kind of guy I want to be. For Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com for making this possible.